Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for our AJ Weekly Zoom. It's a little bit of a different evening for us, and it's something that we don't usually do, but we have had apologies from Senator Holly Hughes. She unfortunately had a bad health issue today that was unprecedented, and she sends her deepest apologies. We have heard from her staff that she is doing well, she is recovering. It is nothing too serious or nothing to worry about. But that does mean, unfortunately, we have had to make a very quick pivot tonight. However, Senator Holly Hughes is very keen to reschedule when she is feeling better. So we wish Senator Holly Hughes all the best, and we look forward to rescheduling and having her on our program soon. With that, we thank Professor Peter Ridd, who took up the post and very last minute agreed to come on as our special guest tonight. Peter, we really thank you for your quick response and your ability to come on tonight. We promise you it'll be an incredible, informative evening and it'll be a wonderful topic, just slightly different to what we had prepared. I'll give you a little bit of background on Professor Peter Ridd. He has a PhD in physics and was the head of the physics department of James Cook University from 2009 to 2016 and head of the Marine Geophysical Laboratory. He challenged those who kept claiming that the Great Barrier Reef was dying due to climate change and exposed issues of university integrity. Although subsequently Peter has been provoked to correct, JCU invoked a technicality to terminate his contract. Peter has recently made a remarkable video commending Jewish contribution to science, which I will put the link in the chat that you can save and watch later. It's a really fabulous video. So tonight with Peter, we will discuss what's happened to university integrity. This is a topical issue, something that, especially since October 7, has been going deeper in the wrong direction. And we are very thankful to have Professor Ridd on board tonight to talk about this issue with us. Thank you, and please welcome Professor Ridd.
Thanks very much, everybody. You want me to start now, Tennille?
Yes, please.
Yeah. David rang me up today and we had a nice chat, and then he very kindly invited me to give this. And even though it's a little bit the last minute, I feel completely honoured that you've invited me to talk here. So I'm going to talk about, just go back to the beginning. I'm going to talk about scientific integrity, integrity of the universities, but also why I made that video on the incredible contribution to Jewish science. So later on, I'm going to talk about why we have such a problem with universities, all the difficulties that are within them, and that they are almost unreformable organizations now. That's how bad they've become. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more about this video I made, which was what did the Jews ever do for us, and why I was motivated to do that. It was partly because, I think in society today, there is almost a hierarchy of despicability and, the hatred. And unfortunately, the Jews are at the top of that hierarchy, where just a ridiculous number of people in society nowadays hate the Jews. But coming from a British background, I think a lot of people, even of my background, and I'm actually English originally, can see that people who are British are well down the tree, but are also well and truly hated. The remarkable contribution that the British have made to society over centuries, or Europeans in general, this is all being eroded away, partly by, to a lot of extent, by the way the universities are doing it. So that was what I think really sort of got me into it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this video. It essentially was that as a physics professor, I obviously knew that there's just Jews everywhere, especially in physics. They've done such a lot of stuff. But it wasn't until I actually dug in and had to make a 10-minute video, and I realized, my goodness, it's just unbelievable, the contribution, especially in the last 150 years. So, for example, 25% of Nobel Prizes are won by Jews. Now, possibly you knew that. I knew it was a lot, but I didn't realize it was quite such an incredible number. And we're talking big names here. Obviously, Albert Einstein, and, he had a tremendous contribution. Most people don't realize just how much the contribution was. the biggest one was actually to quantum mechanics more than the relativity, but relativity was a big deal as well. But then you have people like Fritz Haber, the German, who invented nitrogenous fertilizers. And I think it's quite remarkable that, half of the people in Egypt and the Middle East who hate Israel so much, half of their food effectively comes from the processes that Haber invented to produce nitrogenous fertilizers. Half of the nitrogen atoms in your body actually come out of a factory using the Haber process. That's how important that guy was. Now, he had a bit of a checkered past. There are other things that he did which are a little bit questionable, but overall the good massively outweighs the bad. Or people like Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine. How many people in the Middle East have been saved from crippling by Jonas Salk? So this was the sort of thing that motivated me. But also coming back to the universities, the story of the atom bomb comes back to more older problems that we've seen in the universities, especially in Germany in the 1930s. Because, of course, the invention of the atom bomb was largely a Jewish thing. I mean, they were the main guys behind it. We have obviously Oppenheimer, who was Jewish, who led the Manhattan Project. 20% of the scientists in the Manhattan Project were Jewish. 5 out of the 8 project leaders were Jewish. Now, people might say, well, maybe the atom bomb isn't something you want to boast about, but yeah, would you really have wanted to have Adolf Hitler, the first one to get the atom bomb? Can you imagine what the world would have been like if the German scientists who were striving to get the bomb had got there beforehand? And of course, one of the fortunate things about the expulsion from the universities of a lot of those fabulous Jewish scientists, including Einstein himself, was that they came to the West and that we were able to utilize their tremendous talents. Now, it turned out that the Germans never got even close to inventing the atom bomb. There's an interesting story that the British, at the end of the Second World War, they captured all the German atom bomb scientists, and they weren't really sure just how close the Germans had got. Was there something hidden away that maybe the Russians had found? And so what they did is they locked them up in this building here, and with microphones on all the walls, and they listened to all the conversation. And when the atom bomb fell on Hiroshima, they gave everybody these German scientists all the headlines, and they listened to see what those scientists would say. And of course, they were absolutely dumbstruck by the progress that the Americans and the Jewish scientists had made. And I should add, there's actually an Australian link there, because Sir Mark Oliphant, who's probably the most famous Australian physicist, was working at the University of Birmingham. And he had under him 2 remarkable Jews, Frisch and Perls, who had been chucked out of Germany because of the anti-Semitism in the universities. Mark Oliphant was actually working mainly on the other big technological development of the Second World War, which was microwave radar, which the British were right at the top of. He couldn't actually put Frisch and Perlsman on this project because they were technically enemy aliens, and that was a top secret project. So he asked them a bit to work on what they were real specialists in. And of course, they came up with some of the fundamental designs of the atom bomb. So Australia actually has a link there too. The video also goes on to basically talk about how incredible the anti-Semitism was within the universities. So some of the British scientists would say to their German colleagues, isn't it terrible how, these terrible Nazi chaps are chucking out all these Jewish scientists? And too often the response from the German colleagues of these expelled German Jewish scientists was, well, they're Jews, you should chuck them out. So the anti-Semitism was right through the German university system, that there was widespread support to throw the Jews out. And of course, it was a phenomenal own goal. It gave the Americans the atom bomb ultimately. And I make the point that, of course, Jews have been expelled out of all the countries in the Middle East, 1 million of them or something like that. And hasn't that been a terrible own goal for those countries? That I make the point, if you have Jews and you've got a choice to bring them into your country, you should say, yes, please, we can have as many as we like. Israel has become a technological powerhouse, the only one in the Middle East. And in fact, it's such a powerhouse that it actually puts to shame a lot of other Western countries too. It's obviously the best country in the Middle East by far. So that's sort of what inspired me to do that. But we now might talk a little bit about the situation at our universities. And I asked the question, are the universities the root of so much of the problems, so much of the evil we're seeing in our country today? I mean, when I was a kid, the level of anti-Semitism in Australia, you just couldn't imagine that anybody wasn't supporting the Israelis against the Arabs. It was just, everybody did. The problem in the universities is that they effectively hate virtually everything that's good about our civilization. They hate the British. They hate what Australia has done. They will never find any fault in some of these absolutely noxious cultures, the way they treat women. It doesn't matter whether it's what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs, ironically, the Muslim groups, or what the Afghans will do to the women. They will look over that and then just focus on some of these maybe bad things that happened in our country maybe a few hundred years ago. So I actually firmly believe that universities are seriously some of the most corrupt organisations on earth, and almost all of them are just as bad as each other. Some are a little less bad. Ironically, my own university, James Cook University, who fired me, I think they were actually one of the best universities, and I still think they are. You won't find any anti-Jewish demonstrations at this campus here. So we're actually better there, even though they fired me. I want to talk a little bit about that because people might be interested, because this comes to the integrity of science. I was fired in 2018, I think, but in 2015, I had been talking about how the reef is actually in awfully good shape. And there's a famous case of a reef called Stone Island Reef, which is a relatively large reef close to the town of Bowen. And a whole bunch of scientists have been repeatedly saying for a period of years that there was no coral on this reef. It had all been wiped out, mostly by the effect of farm runoff. And I knew this couldn't be true. So I sent a couple of my guys, because I had a relatively large group working for me, so go down to Stone Island Reef and see if you can find any coral. And these are some of the pictures that they brought back. So it was obvious that these scientists had made a terrible mistake. And my problem wasn't that they'd made an obvious mistake, a mistake as big as a reef, kilometres across. My problem was, what were the quality assurance systems that they used or that they did not use that led them to make this utterly terrible mistake? And I said that they should check their facts before they make these misleading statements. And that was enough to get a charge of being, what was it? I've forgotten what exactly they said, but basically I was being uncollegial, I was being disrespectful, those were the words, and that wouldn't do, so you get hit with a charge. And that then spiraled out, and eventually I ended up being fired. And, it was probably the best thing that could happen to me, because in the end, I don't want to be part of the university system anymore. But when I was fired, or when I got into trouble first in 2015, and I'm putting up here a graph of the amount of coral on the Great Barrier Reef. And I love this graph. I really love this graph. So this is the amount of coral on the Great Barrier Reef since 1985. It's data that's been collected by the Australian Institute of Marine Science. And of course, it shows that we've got record amounts of coral on the Great Barrier Reef at the moment. So when I was getting into trouble in 2015, if there was one thing that I could have prayed for to be, for the future, it would have been record high coral on the Great Barrier Reef. And somehow or other, it came to pass that we've got record high coral on the Great Barrier Reef. Now, that was just luck. But truly, the state of the reef is wonderful. There are 3,000 individual reefs on the coral reef, 3,000 of them. Guess how many reefs of those 3,000 still have wonderful coral? Yeah, you got it, 3,000 of them. Just a couple of days ago, data came out showing that the water temperature of the Great Barrier Reef was the same in 1770 as it was today. Yeah, it dipped in the 1800s and has then come up. So the water temperature is no higher than it was in those days. Now, we know that because corals actually measure their own water temperature. They lock up strontium, calcium, and you can measure that. You drill a hole in big corals and you can work out what the temperature was a long time ago. So what we're seeing here is that what the scientists have been saying, largely in the universities, has been complete and utter rubbish. We had supposedly devastating bleaching events in 2016. Look at 2016 on this graph, and then 17, and then 2020, and then 2022. And we ended up with record amounts of coral. And the type of coral that's exploded the most is the type of coral that those guys claim is the most susceptible to hot water bleaching. It's complete disproves their initial thesis that we've had a problem. So that's wonderful. But I must say that the problem with scientific integrity is much bigger than the universities. I won't get into it, but it turns out that about 50% of the peer-reviewed research turns out to have major flaws. That's not what I'm saying. That's what the big scientific institutions are saying. This is the dirty secret that is well known in the science fraternity, but they don't want to publicize it too much because it's just a little bit embarrassing. But it's true, you know. Now, that doesn't mean that the type of science you get in the old style textbooks, physics textbooks, is 50% wrong. Almost none of that is wrong. But half of the stuff you hear on the news every day or every other day is likely to be wrong. And anything with ideology, like the climate change, the Great Barrier Reef, is got to be seriously questioned. All right, then, so that brings me to the universities. And why do I say that they are truly the most corrupt and terrible institutions that we have? And it comes back to the, not just that they're bad, it's because they have such power. We give these institutions our teenagers, right? But it's worse than that, because those institutions then train our teachers, and our teachers train our children. So is it any wonder that for the first 12 or 15 years of our life, we give our children to those people to be indoctrinated? You can't, you can't think of a better system of losing your civilization if you give these people your children. Now, look, if there's one thing that you could do to improve the universities and improve our society, it would be to take away the teacher training aspect away from the universities. Get teacher training out of the universities. Set up new teacher training colleges which are not ideologically driven. I'll give you an example. At James Cook University, it was no worse than most. The prime focus of the education degree for teaching teachers was stated to be sustainability, environmental sustainability. It wasn't making sure that we've got well-qualified teachers who could teach. It was basically making sure that our teachers know how to indoctrinate our students. That was at the fundamental core of it. And it's the same through virtually every single university teachers training degree we've got. And then we go on. Universities, especially Australian universities, are into visa scamming on an industrial scale. And I mean, it's an industrial scale because higher university is a big industry. If you think that most of the foreign students, or all of the foreign students who come to our universities are doing it because of the wonderful academic standards of our universities, then you're kidding yourself. A lot of them are coming, and I don't blame them. I'm with them. They're coming because if they get an Australian university degree, they get more points to get permanent residency. Good luck to them. Good luck to them if we do that. But the thing is, we allow the universities to accept the payment. So these kids are basically paying partly to get their visa, and the money's going to the university. If we're going to sell visas, which is essentially what we're doing, we may as well actually take the money ourselves. It should go to the government. And then, of course, there's a huge amount of cheating goes on in the university. It's literally on an industrial scale. And of course, a lot of the foreign students who have very poor English, because we don't police that very well, they can actually pay to get a lot of the assignments done. If you Google, I just did that before this, if you Google do my assignment, then you get a series of literally pages and pages of little companies who will do your assignment. So look at these ones here. This is a sponsored ad on Google. We do your assignments, 100% confidentiality. We won't share it with anybody. In other words, they won't tell the university that you've just cheated. So for a couple of $100, you can get your assignment done. And of course, this is happening on a massive scale. The universities know it's happening on a massive scale. They pretend they're doing something about it, but they're not. The fundamental problem is that they don't have enough exams in the university, so they have no idea about who is actually doing the assignments. So God only knows what percentage of the people who are coming out of the universities are actually cheating their way through, but it's not a small amount. If you wanted me to make a guess, I reckon it's probably around 10 or 20%. That's a guess, but the cheating is monumental. Then we have hopeless academic standards, the lowering of grades. Essentially, anybody with a pulse can get in. That's a disgraceful thing to do, because essentially what then happens is half the students that come in fail. And you'll see, I've seen instances again and again and again where a student who is clearly not going to pass is let into university. They fail the first year. The university brings them back to have another go for a second year. So now they've got 2 years of HECS debts. So what you have now is essentially organisations that are putting 18-year-olds into fairly major debt. I can't see how that isn't a form of corruption. Then, of course, they enforce the groupthink and the ideology. It was getting pretty bad when I was there. I remember that we used to have to put what I call the Aboriginal prayer, the Indigenous prayer, on the bottom of all our subject outlines. So if I was teaching advanced electromagnetic theory, I used to have to say, we acknowledge the traditional lines. Well, of course I didn't. I refused to do it. I was one of the only universities that refused to, only academics that refused to do it. But, you know, I can understand why everybody else had to do that, because they knew that if they didn't, they would get fired too. And of course, universities are very good at crushing dissent. One of the problems at universities is in fact that they're no longer run by the academics like in the old days. If you go back to, you know, Sir Mark Oliphant and Pearls and Frisch in the University of Birmingham in 1940 or 41, the head of physics was a big person, right? When I was an undergraduate, the head of physics, Professor Ward, he was a big person, right? He talked to the Vice Chancellor every week or so. When I was head of physics at James Cook University, there were 5 levels of administration between me and the head of the Vice Chancellor. I would never talk to the Vice Chancellor, and I didn't even have a budget line. That's how inconsequential the academics are in decision making. So they've become timid. It's very easy to get rid of them, in fact, and that's one of the problems that we've got there. Now, we've got to remember that universities are a very feared lobby group. Any government that takes on a university or the university sector does it at their own risk. Remember that the University of Sydney, I would guess, has probably 50 at least people who are employed getting stuff out to the media and into public. They probably have more people employed getting stuff, communicating with the public than the Sydney Morning Herald does. That would be my guess. It'd be interesting to do that calculation. Certainly my university had more people employed than employed in the local newspaper. So they have enormous amounts of money, you know, comparable to the amount of money we spend on defence, we spend on education. They're organised, they have a mouthpiece. Universities, the government has to worry about them a lot. And that's why I've got this picture of Dwight Eisenhower, who made the famous comment that we've got to worry about the military-industrial complex because they actually can dictate to governments. We're seeing exactly this happening by the universities. They're dictating to the government on the number of international students, but they also dictate to the government what is the truth. So the truth about the Great Barrier Reef, or the truth about Palestine, or all of these things. They dictate what goes on because they have so much power. So yes, they truly are terrible organisations. Now, I want to just finish off on one large thing that, you know, I did that video essentially to tell people that Jews are fabulous. You know, just look what they've done to our society, more than even I realised. But also to say that there are a huge number of people who are not Hamas supporters. Yes, they're there, and I was shocked just by how many there are. But there's a whole lot of people out here, especially in North Queensland, we don't take to that stuff very well in North Queensland at all. Now, I've got a picture of the Generations Church here, and you may be wondering why. Now, just the other day, I do a lot of talks, and just the other day, I was invited to give a talk on Sunday at the Generations Church up in Cairns, and they wanted me to talk about Jewish science at a church. So that gives you some indication of the depth of feeling there is for Israel. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of people are feeling like this is that, it's not just the Jews that are being targeted, though obviously they are suffering worse than anybody else. But it's everybody, any white fella, anybody of British heritage, any male is feeling targeted by a lot of what's happening in society today. So all I've got to say is that a lot of us are with you. The great majority are with the Jewish community. Thanks very much. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I'll jump in and just do our regular 1-minute promotion, which points to next week. And as we always do, if you're not yet an active supporter of AJA, after this event, please go to the website, which is jewishassociation.org.au, where you can donate. Make sure you've signed up to the email list. Make sure you're following our social media, which has lots of information and breaks information, often first in the country. Next week, we are going to be tackling a particularly controversial subject, the enemy within, why we have certain Jewish groups that betray their own. And I'm sure you're aware of some of those groups being active in Australia, doing quite a lot of damage at the moment. And we have an expert on that subject, Yisrael Medad, who'll be joining us. And I just want to foreshadow that tomorrow, online, and then on the weekend in print, is a pretty hard-hitting statement. Just have a look at the headline there to get the flavour of it. Australia has a jihad-supporting government. So we're calling out, in no uncertain terms, very harshly, some of the things the Labor government is doing at the moment. So,
thank you.
questions?
We'll head into the Q&A section. I'd like to remind everybody, if you have a question, you can use the raise hand button. But if you are shy and you don't want to ask your question on camera, you are always welcome to send me a private message in the chat function, and I can ask your questions for you, because I see there's a lot of you online and not everybody wants to be on camera, so please feel free. We'll start with Jeff, if you'd like to unmute, please.
Greetings. I notice, Peter, thank you for your presentation. I noticed that you made a mention effectively concerning the silent majority who obviously would support Jews and all the other controversial, intelligent people who rail against the information overwhelm that the universities seem to employ. But the problem is, as indeed you will probably concur, that there are so many elements of fraud in society today. Even climate lunacy, as I prefer to call it, has got about 100 to 200 different elements that are so overwhelming that nobody really bothers with it. Now, the same thing could apply to just about everything you said tonight, and one would expect that you could raise the subject of Jew hatred in the same way. Sometimes one begins to think that you can't win. However, the silent majority will eventually win out in the polls, I hope. I really hope.
Well, I obviously hope as well. But I think it is different to some of the other debates, even, some of the crazy things that are going on. I don't think the climate one is entirely crazy. I think it's at least half crazy. But I think the one difference on this one is that there's a whole lot of people with a European heritage who feel that what's happening to the Jews now is actually happening to them, that they're whiting away. Every time somebody does the indigenous prayer, actually, I feel like, well, actually, you're bad-mouthing my ancestors when you do that, right? Every time somebody talks about, you know, the British contribution to slavery, but don't mention the fact that the British got rid of slavery and spent a lot of money to get rid of slavery. You know, an absolutely wonderful thing that the British did. Every time that happens, I feel like my culture is being white-handed away, just the same way, well, not to the same extent, but in a similar way, I guess, to what's happened with the Jews. So I think it's a different in that case, because I think that the big majority feel like we're actually sort of in the same boat. We're just a little bit along the line. Our time will come a little bit later.
Thank you. Alan, would you please unmute?
Yeah, thanks to Neil. Peter, the political left is destroying Western society everywhere, but it has a big advantage in the public sphere these days in that it has most of the mainstream media on its side.
Yeah.
So how do rebels like you, if I can use that word, deal with this handicap in order to get the truth out there?
Look, you're dead right. The mainstream media is a complete disaster. But look, I think we're actually in a less bad situation now than we were 5 or 6 years ago. That, you know, it is still possible to get stuff out on Facebook and YouTube. On the thing that I'm trying to do, which is on the corruption in science, you're actually seeing quite a lot of good stuff in social media. We've got Elon Musk, who you might not agree on a lot of things, but he's at least freed up one of the platforms. And people find ways of saying things which you're not allowed to say, but saying them in a way that everybody knows what you mean. So I think we are actually slowly winning that winning that fight. But my goodness, it is a terrible, terrible problem. I mean, my problem with the Great Barrier Reef is I can't get anybody in the ABC or the SBS to show that graph or anything like that. But that's just one of a multitude of problems. But we get there eventually, I think.
Thank you. Anne, would you like to unmute?
Hi. So I know Jewish students are being threatened and targeted by these Palestinian activists on university campus. So my question is, how safe are the Jewish professors at these universities? And what kind of action, of course, can these students take in order to guarantee their safety, not just for themselves, but for their teachers and the professors who are being threatened by these activists?
Well, they're obviously not safe, and there's very little they can do. There's probably plenty that the university can do, but they're not going to do them. What I'd suggest is, and this may sound a bit strange coming from somebody who was fired from James Cook University, come to James Cook University, because the reality is that in a place like this, you're actually pretty safe in the regional areas. You're actually much safer than you are in the big cities, ironically, but maybe not ironically.
Thank you. Cohen, please unmute. Is it?
No, you haven't unmuted yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter. I've followed your career and to's and fro's over the years, and muzzle tough on the work you do. Point I'd like to get an opinion on is I had a patient friend in Perth who was head of science at one of the universities in WA, and he was telling me about a story with CSIRO to do with climate. And what it was the CSIRO was given a small amount of money to follow weather. And then for that, you know, he employed X number of people and was paid, say, $200,000. Then comes along climate change, and he was given, you know, the X plus about another 8 workers to look after, and he was getting, say, $400,000 a year. And it just so happened that they sent out a couple of these students or workers at CSIRO.
You're going to have to get to your question.
All right, I'll try, but to the Pacific Islands to collect data on some issue. And they came back, and the data they presented happened to be in the exact opposite direction to the story that the CSIRO was planting in the media at the time. And those two guys got the sack. Now, you can just picture the fact that the head of CSIRO was going to lose a lot of money if he came out with the facts.
Yeah, no, you're dead right, Karen. I mean, that's exactly what's happening in the universities. The money is corrupting the universities. The universities are about there to try to find the truth, whatever that is. But actually, they're there to chase the money, whether it's research dollars or whatever, it doesn't matter. And so that is one of the things that has corrupted universities. It's certainly not the only thing, but it's an important factor.
Thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming through the chat, so I'll go to this one. About the Iranian money that's pouring into universities, how influential is funding from the Middle East and China into Australian universities?
To be honest, I don't know. But I think the Chinese one was actually quite important. I knew of a physicist who was basically been sort of paid with a little bit of Chinese money who was working on quantum computing. Now, quantum computing is one of these cutting edge things that whoever gets quantum computing going properly first, basically, they're in a massive advantage. Why we would have one of our scientists at one of our universities involved with Chinese efforts to get quantum computing, I do not know. So I don't know the depth of it, but it should just stop. And I think you'll find actually that has to at least a great extent been whittled down to almost nothing. I hope so.
I think this question also encompasses the international students as well, and the funding that's relied on from international.
Yeah, well, that's an important point. That when you're relying on a cohort from a certain country to a large extent, well, the money talks for these people, and so yes, it's a problem. I mean, our universities in the good old days, when I was an undergraduate, there were a few international students, but it's not like half of a class, or in some cases 3/4 of a class, that you're depending upon these people, and therefore the governments from the countries that they're coming from as well.
Yeah, which we saw in COVID when the borders were closed, the universities suffered a lot in lack of funding.
Yep. Well, they didn't suffer as much as they made out, actually, but anyway.
Saul, would you like to unmute, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. Besides the number of administrators who should be there really only to assist the academics, not to guide them, could you also comment on the role of the NTEU, which seems now to have become a force for obscurantism and indeed also for anti-Semitism?
There's no doubt the number of administrators at a university is around about 50%, maybe 60%, and they're not there to help. They're actually there to cause trouble for the academics. They make work for the academics. It's quite staggering that there isn't one university that hasn't been able to put the broom through the amount of dead wood at a university. Coming to the NTEU, I guess they're like a lot of the unions. They're probably worse in some ways because they're associated with a university. But it's kind of what you expect. You've got a union of people from an extreme radical organization. And remember that most people who are members of the NTEU, most academics are not members of the NTEU. So you've probably got the most extreme people of an organization, which is very, very hard left to start with. So it's kind of not surprising that the NTEU is pretty much a disaster.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Paul in the chat. Is absorption proportional to carbon dioxide concentration, or does it taper logarithmically?
There is a sort of a logarithmic reduction in the intensity as you double the carbon. So if you double the carbon dioxide once, you get a certain reduction in the absorption.
I think in the NTEU.
Sorry, we've got a problem with the muting. Peter, can you unmute yourself again?
Sorry, I didn't realise I'd unmuted.
No,
where should I start here?
Just 30 seconds.
I can't remember what the question was. So
it was
sorry.
about the
absorption
if
of
the
carbon
absorption was proportional or logarithmical.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you double the carbon dioxide concentration once, you'll have a certain reduction. If you double it again, you'll have a much smaller reduction in the amount of absorption. So yeah, as you go more and more carbon dioxide, the effect of any particular increment gets less and less.
I've got a question. This is my question. I'm wondering, with all this stuff we're doing to reduce carbon emissions, do you feel like a lot of the onus has been put on society to reduce personal carbon emissions? So when we're talking electric cars, which still need high-powered electrical stations, we're talking not using straws, when industry is the largest cause of carbon emissions. Do you feel like we are in some ways being a little bit hoodwinked in the way we are trying to reduce this, or it's a step forward?
I think it's massively hoodwink. The carbon dioxide, in my view, will have an effect on the climate. It will get a little bit hotter, a degree. Maybe you can get it to 2 if you really struggle. Now, for most places, that's actually a really, really good thing. You're all southerners, so that's a really good thing for you to be a degree or 2 hot. It's not quite so good for us here, but if I look back 50 years ago when we didn't even have ceiling fans in most houses, and now we've got air conditioners, a 1 or 2 degree increase is nothing to worry about. But essentially what's happening is the whole climate thing is being used as an excuse to carry out an ideological agenda. That's actually what's happening here, to take things away from the people, to stop us traveling, because we're really unclean plebeians who should be kept at home in our place. That's essentially what's happening. It's being used as an agenda. The Great Barrier Reef is being damaged. Therefore, we've got to stop any farm pollutants going out, even though it's unmeasurable amounts. Therefore, we can now control what the farmers do. We can stop, because they might be vegans or vegetarians, we can stop the meat industry by claiming that nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions from cows is somehow affecting the climate. And it's completely crazy, actually. And it's just an excuse to carry out an ideological agenda, in my opinion.
Thank you. Greg, would you please unmute?
Sorry, Greg.
Yes. G'day, Peter. Enjoying your talk. How can an individual or organisation source out where a university will receive its financial influence from? For example, our organisation is studying political Islam and its influence in universities. How can we get access to information that will help us or open up or unhide that influence?
Yeah, that's going to be a tricky one, because you can go to obviously the annual reports, but it won't go down to that level. It will say something like, we received such and such donations for research, but then work out what came from Iran or China, or a good one. That's going to be very, very difficult. You're down to FOI type requests, which are notoriously difficult to actually make stick. So look, I don't know how you do that. But, I think that that's probably not the biggest problem in the universities. It's obviously not something that you want. You don't want the Iranians spending a cent. The biggest problem is the total philosophical bankruptcy of the entire university system is the problem. And the question we should be asking is actually, not so much relatively small questions. I don't want to downplay what you're trying to do. It's obviously an important thing, but it's a much bigger philosophical question: is what on earth are we going to do with universities? Can they be reformed? If not, what do we replace them with? That is actually what we should be asking. So when I was saying we need to just take teacher education out of universities, that's something you can do. You could do that, in 2026. You can start up teacher training colleges. You start them from fresh. You keep them away from the universities. The government stipulates the curriculum very, very precisely, and we can now have proper teacher education. What you do with the humanities faculties at the university, I don't know, but those are the bigger questions I think we need to ask.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
Tennealle, you're muted.
We'll go to our CEO, Robert Gregory, for a question.
How's it going? Thank you so much, Professor. I had a question. You touched on, you were saying that James Cook is one of the better universities in regards to, there's no anti-Israel protests. And I was wondering, so I also studied in Queensland at a different university, which is also very similar. There was, we only had one political group on campus, and that was the campus Liberal group. So what is it about Queensland that the rest of Australia can learn from? Is that a fair observation that things are quite different over there?
It's different. North Queensland especially. I mean, you just got to look at it in the politics. You could just look at it in the percentage of people who voted no in the referendum. And believe me, a lot of people vote no in the referendum because they feel that is actually an attack on our culture. Right, and I hate to use that word because it's used by the other side, but that's basically the way a lot of people feel, that it's nothing to do with trying to help some people in the Aboriginal community. It's actually attacking us. So I don't know why we're different up here, but we are definitely different. And the further north you go, the more sensible you become.
Thank you. Dina, would you like to unmute?
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Ridd. What about the Ramsay Centre? Can you comment on whether that is having any impact, and are there any other independent, non-ideological universities in the developing?
In Australia, I don't know a lot about the Ramsay Centre thing, though. The Ramsay organisation managed to do some pretty silly things during the Voice referendum, in my opinion. Campion College, I think, has got a lot going for it. But even Bond University, which is probably the only one that's a little bit sort of different the way it was set up, I don't know a lot about it. But I know somebody who was in Bond University who made some comments about one of the, the big ideological things. I don't know whether it was the trans issue. I can't remember, but something like that. And he did not feel as though that he would be threatened too badly by making the comments that he did. So maybe Bond is a little bit different to the others. Of course, in America, there are a few good universities. Hillsdale College, I think, stands out, but they're pretty few and far between.
Yeah, Bond is actually where I was, so that's
okay. All right, well, that makes sense. I was trying to work out, I thought maybe University of Southern Queensland in Toowoomba, that would be pretty good. That would be pretty good.
No, Bond was very good.
Yeah,
Everyone was very supportive.
Interesting.
We have another question in the chat. This one's about if universities are tasked with protecting our students and our children. These are, the youth that are there, as well as professors are meant to be seen as the most intelligent, smartest people that we are sending to the next generation to. If they are not fulfilling these requirements, what is the legal processes, especially when professors become so adamantly anti-Israel and are causing a harmful environment for Jewish students? What are the legal processes or what legalities can be used against them for not fulfilling their obligations?
I don't think there are any. I think this is why, you've just about got to close them down. It might take you a while. there's really not much you can do. If somebody is pretty racist against Jews or whatever they are, there's not much you can do unless they do something really out there. They can claim academic freedom, which is something that I'm very, academic freedom is a really important thing. They should be able to criticize Israel. You should be able to criticize Hamas. You should be able to do all these sorts of things. The problem is that it's so one-sided, so that when, for some reason, when the hiring is done at a university, you have 90% of the people there are left-wing or extreme left. And the 10% who aren't, they're all in the engineering and physics department, right? There's just a small group of that 10%. That's where the problem lies. How do you change the makeup rather than, work out how you prosecute some professor who ends up being a left-wing nutter, who, generally speaking, if they want to be a left-wing nutter and say stupid things about Israel, provided they're not inciting violence, and some get pretty close to that, but provided they're not inciting violence, you've actually got to let it go through. So then the question is, why is that for every 100 of those nutters, there might be one sensible person at the university, and that sensible person doesn't feel like they can say anything? That's the question.
Yeah. Susie Smead has a question. If you'd like to unmute, please.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Susie.
Hi, Peter. Lovely to see you.
Yeah.
You're looking extremely well, and I just love you for what you're doing for the Jewish community. I hope to see you soon, actually, again.
Yeah.
Now, what I'd really like to say something to Dr. David Adler, quite apart from listening to your wonderful presentation, which, John and I always love, David. But David, tonight I saw, I think it was on Sky News, about Jason Clare being on the ABC saying that Israel was starving the Palestinians. Now, can you please do something about that? Because I was absolutely disgusted listening to him. That Israel was starving the Palestinians. And I just find the Labor Party, with the propaganda that they're spreading about Israel, is just horrifying. And so true.
Susie, I don't know what the answer is for Jason Clare, and it's a little off topic, but I'll just say this. Jason Clare is the Minister for Education. He has done virtually zero when we have raised issues directly and indirectly concerning the encampments and anti-Semitism on the campuses. And surely it's just a coincidence that his electorate is second highest in the country in terms of Muslim voting percentage, a little over 30%, I think. So we have an extraordinarily difficult situation. I don't know what you can do about those sort of politicians making statements on the ABC. You'll see that tomorrow we're hitting the subject pretty hard, and we'll continue to do so, but we should focus on our guest.
Okay. Well, I'll get back to Peter Ridd. And I know, Peter, you said you were pleased that you'd been sacked from the university.
Sort of.
As you know, we supported you, and you're doing such amazing work, and do keep it up, and I'm sure anyway, that's all I really wanted to say.
Thank you so much. Anne, would you please unmute?
Good evening, Peter. I listen to you all the time on Sky News. Now, after COVID, I'd like to know one basic thing. Who is worse in the scale of things? is it the scientists or the bureaucrats who make the decisions about science?
The scientists. I actually blame the science. You know, if the scientists would just do science, then the bureaucrats or the media or the green organisations or whoever would have the legs cut out of them. But because the scientists, which are at the bottom, because they're the they're the ones who tell us what is true, supposedly, on scientific issues. And because they are not telling us the truth, or often being far more confident about things than they should be, which is essentially the same thing, not telling the truth, they are the fundamental problem. So one of the things that I've been doing is actually trying to get systems in place in science to actually improve it. So we need, you know, science is so full of ideology and groupthink that we've actually got to bring the debate back into science, like the way it should be. We need that to be a formal structure for any science that is going to be used for government policy. If you've got a bit of science you're using for government policy, it needs to go through a process of proper peer review, not the BS peer review that we see, but proper review where the experiments are replicated, that you get in a dissenter like myself or somebody like that who's going to come in and try and tear it to shreds. And if it survives, that's great. And if it doesn't survive, that's great too. So yeah, the scientists are bad. Well, the science institutions are failing us. There's lots and lots of great scientists, but they know what they have to do to keep their job. So they do that.
Thank you. We've got so many questions in the chat, but they are, every time somebody else types in the chat, I lose the question again. So sorry, just to get our final question in, as we are almost out of time. And there was a great question in here. Oh, this was the one I wanted to ask from the chat. Is eco-terrorism a concern in Australia?
Eco-terrorism. Well, I think it's happening. All right, they don't kill people. Well, not directly, but what's going on where, I mean, well, I'll give you an example. I reckon this is pretty damn close to terrorism. You've got a cane farmer down here, and his children go to the local school, and in the curriculum it's saying cane farmers are killing the reef. And the child comes home from school and says to Dad, you're killing the reef. And I know, I can tell you, that hurts them. That hurts them really, really badly, to the point where some people can be pushed over the edge. I reckon that's eco-terrorism. You're not actually blowing up a bomb, but it's sort of like, instead of blowing up your house, you're white-handing it away. You're white-handing away our civilization by spreading these lies and pretending to be truth sayers when you're actually lies sayers. So yeah, eco-terrorism is a problem, but it's a different form to what most people might think it would be.
Well, it takes the shift away from the multinationals and puts it onto the individual, which is easier to attack and to get to. We've got time just for one last question. Ben, please unmute.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, you're on mute. You're perfect.
Right. This isn't a question, but it refers to a previous question. I've put this in the comments, and this is something I think it's important to draw everyone's attention to, because it relates to the question about how do we hold the universities account other than shutting them down. There's a class action lawsuit that's being prepared. It's going to start with an application to the I've forgotten the name of the commission, and it's being run by the barrister Adam Butts, who succeeded against the Victorian government at Brighton College. The 5 boys there, if you don't know about it, were subject to anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
The first, so it's important I've given evidence. I was assaulted at University of Sydney. I've reported that to police. They're investigating. They've identified the individual without the help of the university. It wasn't very helpful when they contacted security. So there is stuff being done. And what we've got to do is assert ourselves through the law. Some of the laws are crappy, and some of the laws we'll succeed with. The government of Victoria was succeeded against, and apparently, there's a strong case against the University of Sydney, and they've picked that first. I've put the link to the.
Yeah, we've done that as well, Ben. Okay.
Okay, brilliant. I wasn't sure if people were.
Yeah, no, we're across it, of course.
We've promoted as much as possible.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well,
Thanks,
with that, we are out of time. Professor, would you like to say your closing remarks, please?
Just thanks very much, and we'll all fight together on this. Just let you know that there's a lot of us who are not Jewish who are with you, and we always were, and I think we always will be, because we're actually in the same boat.
Tremendous.
Thank you so much. Just to remind everybody that this has been recorded. It will be available on YouTube, on our Facebook page to share with your family and friends. I did put the link up to Professor's YouTube video in the chat earlier, but if you didn't see that link or if you'd like more information, please feel free to email us or contact us, office@jewishassociation.org.au, and I will send you the link. And any other questions, please always feel free to send us an email or reach out to us. We would like to thank our guest. It is not every day that you get the call and asked to present a lecture and be online with a couple of hours notice. So you don't understand how much we appreciate you answering our call, being here and giving such a fabulous and informative talk this evening. So thank you very much. And with that, good evening, everybody.